I'm Claire, and I'm lucky enough to work freelance for World Cruising Club. What that means is I get to go to the beginning and the end of rallies around the world and talk to people about boats and cruising without actually having to do it myself. So what I'm going to talk to you today is not so much my knowledge, but it's about all the things that other people have talked to me about. So it's a sort of a combined experience of a lot of other people, not necessarily myself, and I hope I can pass on some tips to you all. So how to prepare for long-distance cruising in about 18 minutes. Takes most people about, I don't know, 2 years to plan for their long-distance cruising, but we'll see what we can do in 20 minutes. So very quickly, what World Cruising Club do is organise rallies. Some of you, I've spoken to somebody this morning, is going to be doing the Channel Islands rally this summer, which is very much an introduction. We go across to Cherbourg and the Channel Islands and back again. But World Cruising Club run the Ark, which you may have heard of, which is the most famous. It had its 30th edition last year. 250 boats across the Atlantic. And on and as far as the World Ark, which is boats that are travelling all the way around the world in over 15 months. So there's a great breadth of experience, all those people doing all those rallies. And it has to be said, it's a very sociable way of going sailing and doing your cruising. So that's what World Cruising Club does. So first of all, what are you going to do? Actually, you're going to decide when and where. And you think you've got the whole world to choose from. But actually, I would suggest get a book and start looking at ocean currents and weather patterns, and then decide where and when you want to go. What kind of climate you want, those kinds of things. Because just as the ancient mariners did, they created those trade routes for a good reason. That was generally where the currents and winds were going to take them. And if you've got, as you'll know from the Solent, 3 knots against you is not something you want to be doing when you're going across an ocean. It'll take you a long time. So first of all, decide when and where, do your homework, do your research, and actually whether you want to be warm or cold. So yeah, our ARC, or World Cruising Club rallies, generally follow those routes, those downwind routes. So along the bottom, that's the ARC, following the current across to the Caribbean, and then back. When you come back across the top, because that's the way that the currents go. Having decided where you want to go, even then there are some route choices. If you were going to cross the Atlantic with the Ark, you could, as traditionally as was done, go straight from Gran Canaria, in the Canary Islands, across to St. Lucia. But the tradition says you go south until the butter melts before you turn across and pick up the trade winds and current. Well, that's where the Cape Verdes are. 2 years ago, we started Arc Plus, which means the rally actually stops in the Cape Verdes for a few days to explore those lovely islands. Whilst they're not somewhere that might be your destination, they're certainly a place that you would want to stop en route if you've got the time. Beautiful islands, and you can't really get there any other way than by boat. On to boat preparation. First of all, there are rules, but there are no rules at the same time. It really much depends what you intend to do. And actually, the more I see it, there are, you can take a 65-foot Oyster, you can take a 30-foot Contessa. These boats are still all going to get around the world, or they will float, and they will sail, and they will get there. But you need to decide what you're going to be doing and what suits your sailing. Are you mostly going to be sailing as a couple? Are you going to be sailing fully crewed? If I look at the World Ark boats, almost all of them end up sailing double-handed. So at some point. So even if you've got a very large boat, they need to be thinking right at the planning stage about whether they're going to be able to sail it double-handed or not. And the ramifications of that are, for example, life rafts. Do you get an 8-man life raft, or you get 2 4-man life rafts? Well, if there's only 2 of you, actually you don't want an 8-man life raft. That's actually arguably a bit dangerous because there's not enough weight in the life raft. So how are you going to sail, and who you're going to sail with is, I think, probably the most important decision. And if I look at the crew coming across the Atlantic, everybody's very pleased to have crossed the Atlantic, but who are the people who had most fun? And they're always the people who got their crew right. That, whether they're sailing double-handed, did they have the experience, and had they done their preparation and planning, so they arrive having sailed with just 2 people, Are they relaxed and happy and had a good time, or had they not done their preparation and actually they're completely exhausted? Or they chose to take, and the worst thing, and I would say that now, is if you've got the worst thing to do is to take two couples who've been sailing together in their own yachts for 30 years. They had the ambition to sail the Atlantic. The two skippers came together on one boat, and they fell out over who ate the chocolate biscuits. It would have been something really simple, who ate the chocolate biscuits at night, and they arrived in St. Lucia having, over a course of 2 weeks, destroyed 30 years of friendship. And so getting the crew right is probably the most important thing you need to think about, other than all the other things involved in running your spaceship, which is your boat. But getting the crew right, really important. So are you going to just sail double-handed, fully crewed? Is it going to be a long-term thing where you're going to carry on around the world, or are you just doing a bucket list, I want to sail the Atlantic and then sail back in the same season? So you'll need a plan that's for all the equipment and everything you buy that's to do with your boat and how you're going to be sailing it. A typical yacht, having said there's everything from an oyster to a Contessa 30, a typical yacht is 45 foot, 9 years old, probably a production boat, so Beneteau, Viggiano, Halberg Rassi, catamarans. There's a lot more catamarans than there ever used to be. Typically, an ark is crewed, so even though people sail double-handed normally, they recognise that if you're going to be at sea for 2 or 3 weeks, you might as well enjoy it, and actually that might mean having a few extra crew, just so you get some downtime. And families, we have a lot of family boats, typically on an ark, and an ark has 200-odd boats. There'll be about 20 kids. And kids, there's a sort of a golden age. They're either not walking, so 6 months old when they can smile and not move, and then there's a period when they don't really come sailing, and then between 5 and before school gets serious, there's a lot of children sailing around the world that are that sort of age being homeschooled. So that's typical ark yacht. Preparing for long-distance cruising as opposed to short-distance cruising? Well, arguably, your priorities don't actually change. You've still got to stay afloat. You've got to stay manoeuvrable. That's arguably more important in the Solent than it is in a big ocean. You've got to keep your rig up, functioning sails for propulsion, and you've got to keep your crew fed and watered. Top tips, they don't change really from short-distance sailing to long-distance sailing. When we look at staying afloat, there's a lot about staying afloat. And I was doing the statistics in my head and going, last year we did have an ark boat that unfortunately sank. But actually, I've been doing the ark now for probably more than 10 years, and that's the first one on the ark in my time. So 250 boats, that's 1,000 boats every 4 years, 2,000 boats, one sunk. So mostly people get it right, and the probability of sinking's not that great. But you have to do the work to make sure that you aren't one of those. So, boat prep checklist. Now, the point I've put a checklist is learn to love lists. I've got a friend here today who's refitting his boat. He's actually just putting it back in the water. I said, how many things are on your list? He said, 247 things, and I've got 6 weeks to do it in. But yeah, it's learn to love lists to make sure that you're getting everything done. So now I'm going to just run through very quickly boat basics, engines, safety, power, food and water, and extra equipment. I could go on all day, as you could see, but learn to love lists. Boat basics, hull. Yes, of course, you've got to look at all of the things around the hull. The interesting thing about this slide is that seacock. I could never understand why you had a bung that fit so neatly into a hole. I was like, if that fails, how's it going to fail? I can't imagine that it's going to neatly fail across the pipe so that bung is going to fit in there. How is it going to break? I've never had one fail. Never had one fail. No, that's not quite true. But apparently if they catastrophically fail, the whole fitting goes through the hull, and that hole is like this big. So when you're putting your little bung next to a nice little hole, bear in mind if in that unlikely event, it's probably an old boat, it would go right the way through. Incidentally, my through-hole fitting failed. We were opening and closing the seacock every day. It was a heads one. And when we finally came to change the head pipe, I realised the handle was just doing nothing at all, and it was open the whole time. Unfortunately, we had some tape, so when we cut through the pipe, because we couldn't get it off, and it started leaking, we could tape it back up again and get the boat hauled out. Actually, the most important thing to do on basics is research your own boat on the internet to see what fails on your own type of boat. If you've ever had an accident, you've realised when you research it, you go, a lot of other people have had the same things fail. Boat basics rig. Think chafe. My top tip would be think chafe. Boats going downwind, they're at sea for a long time, chafe is what's going to happen. But interestingly, over the time I've been doing it, it's not... rope has become stronger with all this kind of dyneema and stuff, so other things fail because it's not the rope that was failed. Jerry the rigger came down a rig and he went through a block. It was a plastic block, carbon block, but because now the line was stronger than the block that it was running through, and he carved through it just coming down the mast once. Which brings you to the thing fuses. So when do you want your spinnaker to explode, or do you want a line to break? What's going to break first? And if you think through that in your sailing, then you might save yourself some money, because something cheap breaks rather than something expensive breaks. Let's think. If you're going offshore, consider the age of your rigging, wire and corrosion. For insurance purposes, you'll need to get your standing rigging changed once every 10 years. But if you're going offshore, then I would suggest getting a professional to check your rig, but get your rigger to show you how to do a daily check, because they'll show you what to look for in hairline cracks. I mean, we went offshore, and fortunately our skipper was also a rigger. He looked at a hairline crack in the mast step and went, I'm not going offshore with that. We did step the mast, and the block at the bottom of the mast fell apart. We would have lost our rig in the weather that we had. So definitely something that you might do if you're going offshore rather than just around the Solent. Messenger lines in the mast, because it's not when, it's if. It's not think what if. If a halyard breaks, it's going to happen. A messenger line means that you can rectify that problem quickly without hassle at sea. Yeah, perhaps go on a mast climbing course. I've been on a mast climbing course, so I can climb a mast using climbing gear on my own, and I find that was very liberating to be able to do that and not rely on other crew. Really interesting. Steering. Trade winds, very demanding steering downwind, because when you're upwind, you can trim the boat and it almost sails itself without you having to hardly touch the helm. That's not the case downwind. You do need to trim your boat so that you're not using too much power to get your auto helm working. Steering quadrant and cables, actually I see those quite a lot, the cables break. And remember that if one cable breaks, probably the other one's going to break as well, so you need two spares, not one spare. So last year somebody used their main sheet outhaul, because it was wire, as a spare wire for their on their steering. But of course, if you've got an autopilot and it doesn't use the same steering cables, it's independently connected to the rudder, then you've got an So what if your steering cables break? Actually, I would use my autopilot is a valid point. Do you want to have a wind pilot? Particularly if you're sailing double-handed, you need more than one alternative way of steering your boat, because if you hand steer across the Atlantic, even half the time single-handed, that's going to be hard work. More on steering. I laughed when I saw this picture, because I inherited this presentation. That steering with a big bar, that's going to be awful hard work. Actually, think how you might set up using lines back to your winches, control lines back to your winches. You can actually steer it using winches and winch handles on the tiller, not standing there trying to do this across, because it's only ever going to happen in a big rolling sea where it's hard, of course. So that's a thing to think about. But yeah, you need to have a go. Make sure it works. Get it out. Have a look. Sails. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to drive across the Atlantic with the best will in the world. Although we have had one arc boat, which was a motorboat, and it did drive across the Atlantic. And you look at the engine hours and you think some people do try, but mostly sails, most important thing. So service them before you go, that's obvious. Think about reefing. How are you going to reef? it's way more important to be thinking about how you're reefing, short-handed, not going up to the mast at night. What are you going to do? What is the combinations that you're going to run day and night? Think about your downwind sail plans, because you will sail differently in a big sea because of the rolling, and you may want a downwind sail that stops rolling. So you may want to consider twin head sails. You may want to consider a parasailer. There's lots of other sailing combinations that you might do in an open ocean that you wouldn't do in the crowded space of the Solent or even the Channel. Things like boom breaks and that kind of thing. Storm sails, trysail, deep reefs. Probably you need them, but possibly you need to have things like storm sails if something happens. So, for example, you lost your mast. Masts don't generally break off at the deck, they break somewhere higher, but suddenly, if you've got a trysail, you can propel yourself across the Atlantic. I've got a great slide of, it was a little fast, it was called Pollux, and it was a small boat, and they were in the racing division, and they used a windsurfer sail as their storm trysail. They lost their mast halfway up the mast somewhere. When they came in, they thought through what happens if we lose our mast, and they had everything down to their nav lights, and because they sorted it out quickly, they could still do 5 or 6 knots, and they didn't actually lose that much time on their Atlantic crossing, despite the fact they lost their mast. Very impressive stuff, but it was just about planning. Engines, tools and spares. I'm no engine expert. At that point, I will be using my sat phone, but have lots of spares and somebody who knows about how to operate them. Fixed or folding prop makes half a knot of difference. You almost certainly these days want a rope cutter on your prop, because there's litter and rope everywhere. Fuel tanks, water traps, we could go on and on. Well, consumables. Actually, fuel is the most important thing. If you leave Bermuda and you've had dirty fuel, or anywhere and you've had dirty fuel, then just having one fuel filter is probably not going to get you very far, which is why you need your sails, obviously. And you're going to have to do it in a rolling sea. So when you're thinking about fuel, think about how maybe you have 2 fuel filters rigged independently so that you can actually just switch to a new fuel filter and then in slow time fix the old one, rather than when the ship is bearing down on you and your engine suddenly failed. So those sorts of things are really worth thinking about. So dual fuel filters, maybe even having a simple, if you are somewhere where there's dodgy fuel, a simple a funnel with a filter in it, so that it's actually going to work for you. It's going to be filtered before it enters the tank. It's not a question of, it's not really if, it's when are you going to get dirty fuel, particularly if you're cruising a long way away. Safety equipment, again, there's a lot of people here who are better at this than I. The only thing I would say is if you've got a life raft, these things are really heavy. And if you have a little valise life raft like that, and you push it in, over time they will slowly expand, and then you'll not be able to get it out of the locker, even to service it, never mind in an emergency. So before you cram your life raft into a locker, think about it. Bilge pumps, fire extinguishers, all these things are going to be much more important offshore. Power management. Actually, probably one of the things that is different when you go offshore, particularly if you've got power-hungry crew. So all those iPads, iPods, and everything else all take a lot more power than you think. And whilst everybody now has got LED lights, so the power consumption has arguably gone down, their demand for onboard electronics, whether that's chart plotters, nav systems, that people use a lot more power than they think, and it will be a really good thing in slow time to work out how much you're going to use and actually get your understanding of power improved. Multiple ways to back up batteries, and the thing from Marguerite, which was sadly that boat that sunk, the thing that they learned was actually you've got your main battery bank, but actually you want your VHF to be on a separate, independent and much more water resilient system that is higher up or in a different place. So think about both batteries and backup batteries and how you're going to charge them, and what if the worst happens and they all get wet. I was sailing down the coast of Portugal and went, lovely smell. No, it smells like burning, and we were burning our batteries. So it does happen. Yeah. Food, water and gas. You would think that was an easy subject. It's an easy subject in the UK. As soon as you go offshore or go to other countries, the systems all change. And by the time you get down to the Canary Islands, they're just going, we don't fill up gas unless it's exactly in this kind of bottle with exactly this kind of fitting, and it's really hard to get. We use propane or butane here. The little blue camping gas, that's butane. You get down into Europe, they're using butane. You go to America, it's all propane. And if you're in the Caribbean, well, frankly, they'll fill up anything, so that's all fine. But it's really hard. I was recently lucky enough to be in the middle of the Pacific, and they have these silver ones. It's like, yep, we will fill anything so long as it's in containers that look like this. And somebody had one that was identical, but it was green. And he was like, in the end, it came down to, so if this green one was grey, you'd fill it. Yeah. So if we get grey paint and fill it, yeah. Gas is a problem. But think about it. If you're connected to shore power, why not use electricity? If you're running your engine to charge batteries, why not use a frying pan on a low setting? Why not think about thermal cookers? Because they're using less gas and possibly an alternative to gas. Cooking is heavy, cooking in heavy weather is all a bit of a challenge, but it's perfectly possible once you've got used to it to do almost anything with a bit of thought. Saltwater pumps, remember to have a clearly labelled tap. Somebody who was using their thought they were using salt water, turned out to be using fresh water, not something you wanted to find out a week after you've left. Yeah, a lot we could talk on food and water, but I would suggest fit a crash bar. I normally talk about provisioning, so my entire hour-long presentation is in this slide, and I think we might just have to give up at that point. But it is more of a challenge, but yes, you can do almost anything. Cooking bread, cooking roasts, tossing pancakes, with a bit of thought, you can do almost anything. And you can pretty much keep your fruit and veggies good all the way across. Anchoring. Actually, I had a very interesting time recently. Anchoring, you think you know how to do it, but you need way more chain than you thought you were going to need. You need alternative anchors, because the anchor that you use in Solent mud is not necessarily going to be working in coral. You need to think about your windlass. Is it good enough to actually to be able to manage a coral head? You may end up in a crowded anchorage and you want a stern anchor. So the whole anchoring techniques is worth thinking about. And that's a rockner, which everybody seems to think is the knees in bee's knees in terms of anchor. But practicing and thinking about it, and more chain. And a bridle. AIS, that has definitely changed in the time that I have been sailing. And I would say AIS gives you a level of security. It makes you think. You can see the commercial shipping you can see on AIS, and that's very comforting, even if you can see them when they're 70 miles away. But fishing boats notoriously don't have AIS. Sailing boats notoriously don't have AIS. And so it's not an answer to everything, but it's certainly a good thing. And radar, the thing I found was using it for spotting squalls in the middle of the night. It never occurred to me that that's what we would use it for, but use it, and it was really good. We sail a long way to get out of a bad squall, or not be in it in the first place. Communications, when people arrive at a new destination, where's the internet? Where's the Wi-Fi? Are we going to be connected? And in Las Palmas, before they left, the most stressful thing is people going, how do we connect? How are we going to manage at sea? It's gone are the days where actually 2 weeks offshore is your release from the rest of the world, but it's something that most people are not used to having to deal with themselves. Setting up your own wireless internet on board and all those internet comms things. There are companies around who will help you, but do it now, well before you start, so that you can get used to using it. You understand how it works. You can fix it if it's going to get broken, because there will be crew wars if your internet goes down, or your ability to talk to your friends and family go down at sea. learn how it works and learn how it works early. There's all sorts of things. Beaulieu Boatjumble is the perfect place for gear, but you might think about if you're out there in the sunshine, biminis, awnings, scoops, hatch covers. This picture here is actually of a bimini, but you see in the middle there's a little fitting. Well, if you pull that fitting down, then it also is a water catcher. And if you don't have a water maker, then what if you run out of water? Actually, you've got a water catcher, then that's a really good thing. Holding tanks by law in a lot of places these days, and if you're in a beautiful anchorage, you really do want a holding tank. You really don't want to be pumping your waste off into the sea. Dinghies and outboards and UV and temperature. Oh yes, they are your car. They are your wheels. Think about those at the planning stage. Spares and repairs. It's easy to say, isn't it? Shops are in short supply in the middle of the ocean. But basically, you're saying, what if something goes wrong? How am I going to fix it? What spares have I got that are absolutely critical? You might think about, it's going to be a big rolling sea, having a toolkit which is a small toolkit that you use every day that you can grab, a bit like a first aid kit, that you can grab your first aid kit, you can grab your toolkit that's going to 98% deal with most of the things that you're going to need at sea. Yeah, repair materials, spares, flexible spares, hose, and that was because we broke our lower shroud. The mast is wobbling all over the place, and what we ended up fixing it with a piece of hose and Dyneema. So those spare bits of hose that you go, when are we ever going to need them, are sometimes handy. And a stowage plan that's in the companion way, that when you, as a skipper, says, get me the whatever it is, the crew can actually go and find whatever it is, so you know where everything is. Other top tips: fit out early and become familiar with boat systems. Yeah, I agree with that. Look out for the knock-on effects. What if this happens? If you can't generate electricity, maybe your gas solenoid doesn't work. And if your gas solenoid doesn't work because that's powered electrically, you've got no cooking. So it's always, what are the knock-on effects of problems? Don't skip on maintenance. And when you've done all of your shopping, remember that your boat is heavy, and heavy boats don't necessarily perform so well, so don't overload your boat. And finally, I thought about training. Actually, at this stage of your planning, training. What have been the most useful courses? So I asked a couple of people, and actually the ISAF offshore safety course, it's not necessarily one that you would think about doing, but actually it's really interesting for the people that you meet on there, because they're quite experienced, or very experienced people. Sea survival course, and a plug for the World Cruising events, Open Boat in Lymington, or Guildford Cruising Seminar, which is in the spring, all of which you can find on the World Cruising website. Right, that's me.